So with the release of Alien Romulus this past weekend, I figured now was the perfect time to not only give you guys my opinion on that movie, but rather the entire franchise. By the way, while we are on the topic of Romulus, note that I won't be talking about any spoilers regarding that movie. So don't worry, you're perfectly fine with watching this video even if you haven't seen Romulus yet. Which, by the way, you should go see it. The rest of the entries will feature spoilers though, so if there's any other Alien movie that you want to watch first before checking this video out, then by all means hit that pause button, check them out, and come back when you're ready, because clearly I'm not going anywhere. Anyway, ever since we were first introduced to the Xenomorph back in 1979, the Alien franchise has been on one hell of a rollercoaster ride in terms of quality. From one of the best sequels in horror movie history to prequels that have fans conflicted, the Alien movies are easily one of the most complicated horror franchises out there. And that's in regards to both the universe itself and what the fanbase thinks is the ideal ranking for the series. What I mean by that is that when it comes to most of the Alien movies, keyword most, fans are completely split as to which ones are bad and which ones are good. So this list is going to be very interesting to say the least. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel if you're a fan of horror movies. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. And finally, as a side note, I will be including the APP movies on today's list. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Horror, and this is every Alien movie ranked from worst to best. Let's get it. Number 9, Alien vs. Predator, Requiem. We start off today's list with one of the non-canon entries of the franchise, AVP, Requiem. While not perfect, the first Alien vs. Predator movie was a lot of fun. So one would expect that the sequel, Requiem, would improve on the formula in just about every single way. Unfortunately, we were wrong. Dead wrong. Even though it had a decent premise with the introduction of a Predator-Xenomorph crossbreed, the movie unfortunately failed to meet expectations. The characters were boring, the story was mediocre at best, and worst of all, a majority of the film was so dark that we could barely see the Xenomorphs and the Predators clash. Number 8, Alien Resurrection. On paper, Alien Resurrection had everything that fans of the franchise could possibly want. The return of Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley, a solid cast that included the likes of Winona Ryder and Ron Perlman, and a brand new xenomorph species that was more dangerous and more powerful than the traditional xenomorph. Unfortunately, a premise and cast are only as good as the execution, and man, the execution of this movie fucking sucked. Ripley's clone became a weird and pale imitation of the badass character that we all fell in love with. Don't get me wrong, I love the idea of bringing back Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, but the Ripley that we had to endure in Resurrection completely ruined the legacy of the character. The film also lacked any and all horror elements, as Resurrection leaned more towards a sci-fi action flick and a B one at that. That means that we would move away from the traditional sci-fi horror genre that we all fell in love with. And do not get me started with the abomination that we saw at the end of the movie. Enough said. Number 7, Alien Covenant. I really wanted to love Alien Covenant, I really did. Unfortunately, the movie failed to answer the questions that us the fans still had, while also complicating the lore of the franchise even more so than it already was. Covenant continued to follow David, a Weyland-Yutani android and a survivor of the previous movie, Prometheus. While Michael Fassbender's performance as David in both Prometheus and Covenant was incredible, everything else about the movie failed to impress. The talent of the cast was a major downgrade from Prometheus, and a lot of the questions and cliffhangers that we were introduced to in Prometheus ultimately led to nothing interesting or exciting. In fact, all of the major plot points left over from Prometheus were basically skimmed over quickly, including the death of the engineers' home planet and even the main character of the previous movie. Also, despite having the alien name in its title, Covenant didn't feature iconic xenomorphs, at least not the traditional xenomorphs. On top of that, Covenant introduced conflicting narratives about the lore of the franchise while also leaving us with more unanswered questions that we had before the movie release. Number 6, Alien vs. Predator. To be honest, I'm much higher on this movie than most people are out there, mainly because I just think it's a fun and exciting movie to watch. Getting the chance to watch two of my favorite horror icons face off against each other was incredible to see. Even if the story was a bit off and the cast was definitely one of the weaker casts of the series. Still, everything that I hated about the sequel wasn't a problem in this movie. For example, the cinematography wasn't an issue here at all. Unlike the sequel, this film didn't suffer from the aliens and predators being hidden in dark sequences. Also, the fight scenes between the creatures was much more exciting to watch compared to the sequel. And surprisingly, the movie featured a lot more horror elements than both Covenant and Resurrection, making it a scarier horror movie despite the premise of it. Overall, AVP may not be as scary as the other entries of the series are, and it may contradict the lore of the Alien franchise as a whole, but it's at the very least a good time for fans of sci-fi horror. Number 5. Alien 3. The Alien franchise has always been a hit or miss series. As a matter of fact, I would argue that a majority of the Alien movies have fans extremely divided, more so than most horror franchises out there. And it really all started with Alien 3. After 2 juggernaut entries of the series, Alien 3 took a much darker approach with its 3rd installment, which ultimately divided the fanbase. Now personally, I actually don't hate this movie as some people do, but I also don't love it, which is exactly why it finds itself in the number 5 spot for me. The first mistake the movie makes is the decision to completely retcon just about everything about the previous film. The survivors of Aliens are killed off, with the exception of Ripley, of course. Then, to make matters worse, they even kill off the franchise protagonist in the most horrible and predictable way. From the very start of the movie, she's been infected by a facehugger, and unsurprisingly to anybody watching this film for the first time, she kills herself in order to kill the chestburster inside of her. Not to mention that the rest of the cast are extremely unlikable due to the main setting of the film being a prison. The saving grace of this movie comes from 3 things. 1. Ripley is still a badass. 2. The movie actually leans more heavily towards the horror elements than the second installment of the franchise did. And 3. The new xenomorph creature that's born from a dog was terrifying while also establishing a new concept in the movies, that xenomorphs take on similar traits of the host that they are born from. All of these elements keep Alien 3 from falling farther down on this list, but also not rising up higher on this list. Number 4. Prometheus. While most fans would argue that Covenant wasn't a great addition to the Alien franchise, Prometheus is a much more divisive prequel. Serving as the backstory on the engineers, the alien species first seen as the space jockey in the 1979 Alien film, Prometheus follows a crew sent to explore the origins of the human race on a planet light years from Earth. One of the complaints of Prometheus is that it introduced more questions than answers regarding the engineer specifically. Also, the fact that this film would mark Ridley Scott's return to the series as a director may have raised expectations for the film to turn out a certain way. Ultimately though, I think the biggest complaint from fans come from the fact that the movie felt vastly different from any other movie of the series. With all of that in mind though, the movie wasn't bad in my opinion. The cast is one of the best of the series, with actors like Idris Elba, Charlize Theron, and Guy Pearce. And as I said when I was talking about Covenant, Fassbender's portrayal of David the android is a highlight of the prequels. If only the film was more of a standalone Alien film, or it didn't complicate the lore so much by leaving us with so many unanswered questions, then maybe this movie wouldn't be so hated by some of the fans out there. Number 3. Alien Romulus. Well, more than likely the main reason why you guys are watching this video is to see what I thought about Alien Romulus compared to the rest of the franchise. And as you can see, I loved it. I thought Romulus was one of the best Alien movies in over 30 years. Fede Alvarez is on a roll with horror movies, and this guy deserves all of the love and attention that he's getting right now. Anyway, Romulus goes back to the horror roots of the franchise, as it's easily one of the scariest Alien movies that I've ever seen. Especially with the scenes involving the facehuggers. Those things are actually fucking terrifying. The decision to use practical effects, by the way, was a fantastic choice. Later Alien movies went the route of CGI creatures, and honestly, it always gave the creatures a weird look to them. However, with practical effects, the aliens of this movie have never looked better. Oh, and one of my biggest concerns coming into this movie was the young adult cast. Thankfully, I was wrong to worry about that, as each actor knocked it out of the park, with my favorite being the new android, Andy. I really only have 2 complaints about this movie. 1, I wish the crew was bigger. I think the lack of bodies for the aliens to kill made the creatures less intimidating than we've seen in previous entries of the series. The second issue that I have with the movie comes from the first act. The movie takes a pretty long time to get going, which I guess is in line with the original film in that way. Personally, I would have rather the film spend less time with the opening and more time with the xenomorphs specifically. Overall though, this movie was a major step up compared to the last, 4 Alien movies? Number 2, Aliens. Some people might be shocked to see Aliens now claim the number 1 spot, but I'll get to that in just a moment. Let's first talk about why Aliens is a masterpiece, and to this day it's one of the best sci-fi horror movies of all time. While it may not be the scariest movie of the franchise, Aliens takes a completely different approach than most of the series. It focuses more on action versus horror as it introduces a new version of the xenomorphs, warriors. The xenomorphs are a much more mature than the one that we saw in the original movie and appear to be more aggressive. And whereas the original movie chose to focus on a single alien killing the crew of the Nostromo, Aliens focuses on an entire planet of them, which results in some pretty intense action sequences. The sequel also featured colonial marines, trained soldiers that were able to fight against the xenomorphs this time, and even featured a more badass Ripley. Actually, Ripley is at her best in this movie. She even defeats a queen xenomorph, which of course leads to one of the most iconic quotes of the series.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Number 1, Alien. Okay, so I went back and forth about which movie do I like better, Alien or Aliens? And I guess I want to start by saying that it's extremely close for me. But personally, the original film is my pick for the best movie of the franchise. And honestly, I think it comes down to my personal preference of horror over action. I love Aliens, I really do, but the scare factor of that original Alien movie with a single xenomorph stalking the crew of the Nostromo is legendary. Starting with the opening sequence that leads to one of the crew members getting infected with a facehugger. This sequence leads to one of the most iconic scenes ever, the chestbuster scene. Seeing Kane feel the xenomorph toss and turn inside of him before it busts out of his chest is both terrifying and painful to watch. And this is just the start of the horrors to come. From here, the creature matures into an adult xenomorph and begins hunting down each member one by one until only Ripley remains. The only negative I can say about the movie is that the final act of the film is a bit slow and anticlimactic. But even with that in mind, the original film is still without a doubt my favorite of the franchise. Again, probably because I prefer horror over action. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Horror. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Alien the best film of the franchise, or is there a different movie that's deserving of that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Horror. Take care.